Good morning, everyone. This is Charlie Levesque with the Northeast State Foresters Association. Welcome to the first in a series of 4 webinars on forest carbon from Securing Northeast Forest Carbon Program. The whole program is funded through a grant from the USDA Forest Service to the Northeast State Foresters Association. NEFA, as we call it, is an organization of the state foresters of the northeastern states of New England and New York. We have a website and we encourage you to go there. Everything about the program and these webinars is listed there. You should see it on the screen. It's www.northeastforestcarbon.org. A reminder that each of the states in the New England, New York 7-state region has a state lead contact for the program, and all that information is on the website. So if you are a forester, SAF CFEs will be granted after this. You have to stay on for the whole webinar and you'll receive an email with a certificate directly. If you don't, you can email me. My email address is on the screen. Levesque@inrs.com. And you may know that this one and the next 3 webinars will all be recorded and available for everyone to use after each webinar and beyond. They'll be posted on the website for long term. You probably have registered for others, or at least some of you have, but you know that next week on May 11th, May 11th is the Science of Forest Carbon Management. This one, of course, is the Science of Forest Carbon. On the 18th is Forest Carbon Markets Overview, and also some information from NRCS on forest carbon opportunities in their funding programs. And then lastly, on May 25th, Forest Carbon Project Developers, where we'll have 5 different forest carbon developers talking about their programs with an opportunity for you to ask questions. So a little bit on the tech before we get started, and then we'll get started very soon. You'll notice that you're all on mute, and you will remain that way and with no video access. We're only using the chat for communications. You should not have a Q&A opportunity on your screen. Chat is where the questions will be posed. A reminder that over 600 people have registered for this webinar. I'm showing 360 are on at this point in time. So use the chat sparingly, but do use it obviously for questions. We'll get to questions after the presentation. So a reminder, when you do post questions, to make sure that everyone can see it, you need to make sure that it's in the everyone mode in the chat. That way everybody can see your questions. Do not use the raise hand function. We're not going to recognize people during this webinar because of the numbers that are on. And you know, the questions themselves, obviously with this many people, we're not likely to be able to get through all of them. We're going to spend the last half hour going through them. We'll do the best we can to get them. And if your question is not answered during the webinar and you really want it answered, all you got to do is email me directly, Levesque@inrs.com, llc.com. And obviously that email address is on the website as well. But email me the question and we'll get it answered for you afterwards. But we're not going to clean up all the questions that didn't get answered on the chat. It's just too many with this many people involved. And so we'll do the best we can to get back to you one-on-one. And so with that, we're about to start here. And I want to welcome Dr. Alexandra Kosiba, who is the climate forester for the state of Vermont. She's going to be presenting today and at the next 2 webinars as our lead presenter. And I'm going to let you take it away, Ali. Go ahead and put up your PowerPoint presentation and take it away. And I'm going to go off the screen.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Let me just share my screen here. This is the first of 3 presentations, as Charlie said, Science of Forest Carbon, that will be the foundation for the next 2 webinars. So a lot of the information here is foundational to carbon science and climate change. I am going to turn off my camera just so you can see the entire screen here. All right. So Charlie, let me know if anything's amiss here, but I'm going to.
It looks great.
Go, great, that sounds good. All right, so the reason, so first of all, Charlie mentioned that our website to check out, please peruse that, has information for foresters and landowners and other audiences. Today, I'm going to be talking about global carbon cycles and climate change. Why we're here is talking about the role of forests and how they can help us mitigate climate change. I'll talk about how that works. I will introduce key terms and concepts so we're all on the same page and have that information to be good communicators. I will talk about what it looks like in our forests here in the Northeast. I am going to be this project, and these modules are really focused on our 7-state New England and New York region, and that's where most of the information that I'm presenting comes from. But these topics are pretty universal to what's going on in the rest of the country and the rest of the world. I'll then dive into what it looks like in our forest. We call these forest carbon pools, so how carbon moves around and how is the dynamics of carbon in the forest. I'll end with some take-home points to kind of wrap it up, and as Charlie mentioned, we will have some time for Q&A as we best can with this size of audience. So why we're talking about carbon is really actually because of this global carbon cycle that we have on Earth. Carbon is integral to all life on Earth. It makes up, human bodies, our bodies. It makes up all biological life. Is an energy source and a building block, and it's incredibly powerful and important element that we have in our world. And so when we look at how carbon moves and is stored in our Earth, we can divide them into these carbon pools or reservoirs of carbon. And the size of these circles are somewhat representative of the size they are on Earth, right? So this means the ocean pool, surprisingly, actually stores the most carbon of all the other pools. And these arrows indicate how carbon moves between these pools. And the gray arrows are sort of natural processes that happen. And I highlighted these two, land use and fossil fuel use in industry, as really anthropogenic or human induced changes. And you can see they're flexing, they're moving carbon from this geologic pool. So that's really carbon locked away deep in our Earth that has been there, taken millennia to get there. And the biogenic pool, which is a fancy way to say, all living parts of our Earth. So on the surface of the Earth, the trees and our wetlands, grasslands, etc. So we've increased the transfer of carbon from those two pools. And what that meant is those two pools have shrunk and the atmospheric pool has grown. And that's really the process that we're talking about here, is that we have more carbon in the atmosphere than we would have without land use change, the clearing of forests for agriculture and development, and of course, fossil fuel combustion. Luckily, the oceans and as well as plants and soils have absorbed some of this extra carbon. So oceans have done this through a process that's a little bit different than how plants and soils take in carbon from the air. They make carbonates. But we know that with regrowth of forests, recovery of forests, land that has been converted back to forests, like most of New England and New York, where we've seen that the biogenic and pediologic soil pools have absorbed a lot of this extra carbon that we have. We do know that carbon released into the atmosphere has an affinity to form carbon dioxide. And the thing about carbon dioxide, it's a really powerful greenhouse gas. And there are multiple greenhouse gases that exist, like methane, also water vapor. We do know that carbon dioxide is responsible for about 20% of the Earth's warming, but it also is the main greenhouse gas that we emit through the burning of fossil fuels and through land use change. So it is one of the fossil fuels, the greenhouse gases we have the most ability to control, but it also is responsible for affecting the amount of water vapor in our atmosphere, which then affects additional warming. So we really focus in on carbon dioxide in our climate change conversations. That doesn't mean that there are not other greenhouse gases that are important for us to control and consider. And we do know that when we look back in time through research that looks at ice cores in Arctic areas of our world, looks at tree rings, the pattern between tree growth and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, we can model back in time, scientists can model carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the associated temperatures. And we know that there's a very direct link between those two factors. And so this is one of the reasons that we really are focused on carbon dioxide as the main mechanism that's causing climate change. And as I mentioned, our natural ecosystems have really done an incredible job considering all the things we've done to them as humans, but they have helped us absorb the excess carbon dioxide, some of this. So this red line here is our concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, but the blue line is actually our carbon emissions. And you can see that our carbon concentrations in the atmosphere have not kept up with our emissions. And this is because our oceans and the regrowth of forests, recovery of wetlands have absorbed a considerable amount of this excess carbon dioxide. But there is a limitation to the amount that they can absorb. And so this does really put the onus on us as humans to reduce fossil fuel use and combustion as well. Why greenhouse gases are important, why we're talking about them, is because of the greenhouse effect. It's actually a pretty simple mechanism that happens in our atmosphere, and that doesn't mean that the resulting impacts of the greenhouse effect on our Earth are simple. They're very complex. But what's happening in our atmosphere is pretty intuitive when we think about greenhouse gases. So these little green dots here are representing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, and they exist naturally. We rely on greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to trap some of the solar radiation that comes in from the sun. If we didn't have greenhouse gases and we didn't have an atmosphere, our planet would be cold and not livable. The issue is that we have increased the concentration of those greenhouse gases. So what this means is more heat has been trapped. By these greenhouse gases. They basically reflect that heat back to the Earth. And so we get an increase in temperature. Increase in global temperature has also affects other weather processes and other climate processes. You may have heard about hurricanes increasing in severity or extent, windstorms, precipitation patterns. So there's a lot of other effects from this mechanism. But that's what we're talking about here, is this increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I'm going to show this little video because I think it's really a great way to sort of look at and understand this pattern of transfer of carbon amongst these pools or reservoirs in our Earth. And this is a really great resource from Berkeley Earth. They do a lot of incredible graphics, visuals, and short videos on climate change and carbon. So I'm going to play this, and what you'll see is that they represent the carbon pools or reservoirs by these blocks, and the video will start pre-industrial time when we haven't tapped into fossil fuel deposits. And what you'll see is each one of these little dots is a unit of carbon, and there's transfer between the pools. So we have the biosphere here and the oceans here. And now you see we're up to 1850. We have fossil fuel deposits. And you can see that there's different speeds of transfer of carbon here in and out of these pools. The fossil fuel deposits will slowly get released out into the atmosphere, and this will speed up as we get closer in time to today's date when we're using more and more fossil fuels every year. And notice too that the carbon in the geologic pool, so that's in the Earth's crust, very slow transfer of carbon into that pool. So that represents how long it takes for carbon to go back and become fossil fuels, become oil or natural gas or coal. It takes a long time relative to the speed at which we are emitting it back to the atmosphere. And you'll notice too that we are at a deficit in this biosphere, indicated by this negative number right here. And that's an effect of land use change. So we've globally cleared, a percentage of our forests in New England. And in New York, historically before colonization, we had, something like 90% forest cover, even higher. And now we're about maybe 70%. So we're still at a deficit and have not recovered fully to those pre-colonial or pre-industrial amounts of carbon in the forest. And so you can see we're now at today, or 2017 is when this goes to. And you can see that we are still at a deficit in this biosphere. We're obviously at a deficit in this fossil fuel pool because that's the amount we've taken out, a much faster rate than it can be replenished by natural processes. And each one of these red dots represents carbon that came from the fossil fuel pool. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts the same, whether it came from combustion of fossil fuels or if it came from a natural process of decomposition, or does not matter. But the way we can represent that carbon from the fossil fuels shows you that the carbon dioxide will end up getting absorbed into these other pools and moved around into this system. Trees and forests in particular are incredible at taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's what they do naturally through the process of photosynthesis. So we know that trees take in CO2 and they produce sugars, food for themselves and food for other life forms. Glucose in particular and other sugars like sucrose, fructose, all made of carbon compounds. And carbon is this incredible molecule that can form really tight bonds with other elements. So it has a lot of energy stored into it. And that's why it's really the universal food source and energy source for all life on Earth. Trees are incredible in their use of carbon. Half of the dry weight of wood is carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere. And so we know that lignin and cellulose, hemicellulose, which are the main components of wood, are these really complex carbon chains and molecules. And this gives wood its incredible properties like flexibility, durability, strength, ability to be burnt and combusted as a source of fuel, right? We can make paper and plywood, all sorts of different products from wood because of these structures that exist in wood. But we also know that carbon isn't static in our forests. It is moving around and constantly what we say in flux or dynamic. And so while trees take in CO2 from the atmosphere, and they store quite a large amount of that in the wood to grow larger. They store some as a future food source. So they keep sugars and other elements in their roots and in their branches as a source of food for other times. But they also transfer that carbon to other parts of the forest, or it gets eaten or consumed by insects, animals, fungi, all sorts of different life forms in the forest. And those life forms then incorporate that carbon into their own bodies and it gets cycled through. So it's a very complex, dynamic process of carbon in our forest. And in those processes, quite a lot of the carbon will get emitted back as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So carbon is never permanently stored in our forests. It's sort of cycled around at different time frames and will get released and then reabsorbed into the forest. And in fact, this process is so strong that we can actually see the influence of the greening up of the deciduous forest in the Northern Hemisphere, which is, a huge amount of forest that expands from here, right, in New England, New York, across, all the way Europe and Russia and China. And the greening up of that forest every spring, rapid growth in the summer, kind of slowing down in the fall, is actually reflected in our global CO2 concentrations. That's how powerful of an effect forests have on our Earth and our climate budget. I'm going to go over some terms about carbon because I do recognize that these are confusing. They're new to a lot of us, and sometimes they get used in different ways that are hard to understand or affect our communication talking about carbon and climate change. So first of all, we have carbon storage. So that's the amount of carbon in an entity. So that could be in a tree, that could be an acre of forest, cord of wood. Some folks use stock to talk about this, so carbon stock, carbon density. And confusingly, and I'm guilty of this too, but some people will say has been sequestered over time. And so carbon sequestration is really the process of taking carbon dioxide out from the atmosphere and storing it for a long time. So the one way I describe carbon storage is your bank account. That's sort of a fixed amount in time, right? Today, maybe you have $500 in your bank account. Carbon sequestration are your deposits. So maybe every month you put in $50 into that bank account. But some months, maybe you can only put $20 in. So that rate might not be consistent, but you're adding to the bank and that storage will grow by the amount you've sequestered. Sometimes people use absorbed, took in, storage rate, change in storage to describe sequestration. They're all sort of synonymous with carbon sequestration. And the opposite of carbon sequestration, carbon emissions. So this is release of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And this can happen just naturally in metabolic processes that all cells and life forms need to go through. So it's basically breaking apart and using those carbon molecules, that sucrose or glucose, lignin, all those molecules that a plant or a tree makes need to be broken down into making new molecules. And that will release some carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And decomposition is similar. We can also have methane released in that process, which I mentioned is a greenhouse gas. And then we can have combustion, which is burning of wood, can also release both carbon dioxide and methane back to the atmosphere. So carbon emissions are like withdrawals from your bank account. So again, this could change. It's a rate. It can change over time. Maybe most months you're only withdrawing $10. Some months it's more. And that will decrease the amount of stored carbon. When we combine carbon sequestration and carbon emissions, we have a term called carbon flux. So it's really just a change in carbon storage. Because you might have in a forest, you're going to have both emissions and sequestration. And we call negative flux, so a negative number usually is how we represent that, is net sequestration. And the term we use for this kind of system is a carbon sink. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. That just means that carbon is getting stored and accruing in that tree or that forest over time. And if we had a positive flux, so a positive number, that means that entity is a source of emissions. So we call that carbon source, net emissions, and I'll show some examples of when that can happen. Generally, for easier comparisons, we convert carbon and other greenhouse gases to the same unit. So trees are taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're really breaking apart that carbon dioxide molecule and storing and using the carbon, maybe the oxygen elsewhere, or releasing the oxygen. And so it's just easier and makes it more comparable when we use the same units. So generally, we convert everything to what we call carbon dioxide equivalent. And so we'll do this too with other greenhouse gases like methane, so we can compare. And one reason this is really important, showing here on the right side, is we can compare sequestration of a forest. So this example of a forest sequestering 1.3 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, we can compare that to, say, emissions of an average Vermonter. Here I'm in Vermont, so this is a calculation I've done, or an average car, right? So we can use them as comparing apples to apples, or looking at even not the rate, we can look at the storage too, and compare that to a unit that is intuitive to people, like a quart of firewood. Lots of folks wonder how you can have a metric ton of a gas, because carbon dioxide is a gas in our atmosphere, and you can, it just is very big. So if you represented a metric ton of carbon dioxide, it would be a cube that's 27 feet on all sides. That's really big. It's a lot of carbon dioxide, and that's what 1 metric ton would look like. And for conversion, I added a few here. A metric ton is, a little bit over 2,000 pounds. If you want to convert a metric ton of carbon to carbon dioxide equivalent, you multiply by 3.67. And there's also, talking about whether we're talking about a hectare or an acre is really important in our communication. When we look at our forests here in the Northeast, our forests store an incredible amount of carbon. It is equivalent to about 54 years of our region's current greenhouse gas emissions. So this is if we, somehow, not going to happen, but if all of our forests burnt to the ground and released all the carbon they stored, that would be 54 times our region's annual greenhouse gas emissions that we have from driving, heating our homes, from industry, all the other emission sources we have. And so that's about 17.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that is stored in our forests. And this shows what that looks like across our different states, really reflective of how much forest, the number of forest acres each of our states have. So if we look at that on average, it's about 368 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. Collectively, our forests here are what we call a carbon sink. So their net sequestration of carbon is happening across our forests on average when we take them all together. So that looks like this is for data for 2018, right? Because sequestration happens on a rate basis. So we need to talk about it in terms of time. So in 2018, our forests of the Northeast sequestered about 53 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Note the negative here shows that that's a net sequestration, net sink. And you can see that varies by state, again, reflective of the amount of forest each of our states have. If we average that by the area of forest in each of our states, it's about negative 1.2 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre in 2018. And when we compare that to each of our states' annual emissions, on average, it's about 14% of our annual emissions are taken in or mitigated by carbon sequestration of our forests. And this varies considerably by our states because each of our states, remember, have different amounts of forest and different populations. And so that's really what's driven. It's a ratio of emissions from each state and forest sequestration. The carbon mitigation effect of our forests here in the Northeast is really attributed to the regrowth of our forests. That's why we have a very strong and powerful sequestration rate every year. And you can see here, this is a graph from woodlands and wildlands showing the decline in our forest cover through all of our states over time, sort of hitting a minimum amount of forest cover in like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so that was our lowest forest carbon stock. And we had, in that forest loss period, we had a lot of carbon emissions. Forests were being cleared, burned, converted to agriculture mostly, but also developed areas and other land uses. Since then, we've had really incredibly powerful and remarkable regrowth in our forests. And so we're getting net sequestration. We're having forests regrow on old pasture and mature and take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the tree parts and in the soil. Although recently, just in the last 2 decades or so, maybe a little earlier than that, most of our states, all of our states have experienced some amount of forest loss again. And we never quite got to those pre-industrial or pre-colonial levels of forest. And so we never quite made it back to our carbon stock that we had historically. We do think some effects of climate change might be affecting the rate of carbon sequestration by our forests too, in a positive way, actually. Because we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's easier for plants and trees to take that carbon dioxide and convert it into wood and store it. So we also are experiencing longer growing seasons that can be beneficial. But in the long term, when we think of the future, climate change itself really poses a risk to forests, forest health, their productivity, which means that it poses a risk to forests to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, store that carbon dioxide, and to keep it stored for a long period of time, right? And that's what we're talking about here. When we talk about forest carbon, is we want that carbon to be stayed locked away and out of the atmosphere for as long as it can be. We know that from research that's happening around the world, that while there are some positive benefits to climate change that I mentioned, increased carbon dioxide concentrations, longer growing seasons, there's many, many negative effects of climate change. We could see increased mortality of trees, right? That reduces their ability to sequester and store carbon and increases emissions. More stressors like insects and disease that affects them. Disturbances, decomposition rates might increase, and we just see more emissions because of warmer temperatures. And we could see failure in regeneration. So thinking about the future forest, we need to have a future forest to have continued sequestration and storage of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, really imperative when we're talking about carbon and forest and management, which I'll talk about in the next module, that we make sure to ensure that those are climate resilient forests. And there, I'll mention this and talk about it next week, but really focusing on resilient forests that are adapted to future climate change conditions will ensure that not only do we have carbon sequestered and stored now, but it stays stored and it continues to be sequestered in the long term. Because whether a forest is a sink or a source of carbon really depends on this, somewhat delicate balance between uptake and release. So carbon sequestration through photosynthesis or transfer of that carbon from trees and plants to other carbon pools, and I'll talk about what that looks like. Over carbon emissions, so that release of carbon to the atmosphere through respiration, decomposition, decay, and combustion. And these factors are affected by climate, by the site conditions, right? How much nutrients are there, the soil, how dense are the trees, and then tree factors. What are the species? How healthy are they? What age are they? So there's a lot of going on that affects this balance that makes carbon and carbon dynamics in forests pretty complex. Not all forests are carbon sinks for natural reasons or anthropogenic reasons. And mostly this comes down to disturbance. So when we have things like fire, forest, this is happening in the West with widespread forest fires. Many of those Western states where forest fires are happening are carbon sources. I said that our New England states and New York, we're carbon sinks. Our forests are carbon sinks, but there are other places in this country and the world where that's not true because of disturbances. We might have things like defoliation events shown up in this top figure. And typically events like this is from maple leaf cutter, don't really affect trees too much. They can store carbon, quite a lot of carbon that helps them in events like this. But when we have defoliation events that last multiple years or cause mortality, those certainly can turn a forest stand or a region into a carbon source. Certainly when we have things like windstorms, hurricanes, ice events that break branches, topple trees, and kill trees, means that these trees are no longer acting as, they're no longer sequestering carbon, they're storing it, but as they slowly decompose, that carbon will be released into the atmosphere. It will get consumed by fungi, bacteria, eventually becoming part of the organic layer in this forest. But this forest will become a carbon source. And then certainly when we manage forests, we're taking carbon out of the forest. So wood is carbon. And so this can mean that the forest, for a short amount of time after harvest, is a source of carbon. And it really does depend on where these logs go and what they're used for. And I'll talk about that as well. When we think about carbon dynamics too, it's really important to think about a land, what scale we're talking about and over what time. Any one stand can be really dynamic in its carbon for various reasons. So like I mentioned, there could be a timber harvest that removes some of the carbon and reduces the total stored carbon for a period of time. Regrowth happens and that forest stand recovers to its previous carbon storage levels, but maybe there are some periodic disturbances here or a drought that also affect the ability of that forest to take in and store carbon. And so you can see that over time, this can vary, and over which time periods we're talking about. If we talk from time 0 to time 10 here, we have a net increase in carbon storage. But if we looked at shorter time frames, we might see a different pattern. And then if we look at different spatial scales, so if we scale up to the landscape, while this stand may have been experiencing a loss of carbon in this time period, another stand is experiencing a rapid increase. And so over time, we'll see that when we take those different stands together, this sort of balances out. And this is what we're seeing across our landscape for our states, is that we're seeing, overall a net increase in carbon storage over time. We can look at carbon pools not only in that global level I showed at the beginning of this presentation, but within the forest. And it helps us think about the dynamics that happen within a forest more specifically. So on this right side is a little schematic of these pools. So most of us think about trees when we think about a forest. So we call this the above ground live biomass. So that's our live trees, shrubs. That's just the amount of biomass that we can convert to carbon. So that's the weight of these trees and parts. And then we have the below ground live biomass. We typically combine these into a live tree biomass pool. And then we have litter. And each one of these dotted arrows indicates a flux between pools, so sequestration rate. So we have influx of carbon dioxide coming into the growing, photosynthesizing trees. And as those needles are shed, deciduous leaves are shed in the fall, they become part of this leaf litter pool. Fine branches are included in here. And there's going to be some amount of decay and emissions from this litter pool because of organisms breaking down that leaf litter and weather events breaking down that leaf litter. So at each one of these pools, you'll have some loss of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Trees die and they can become deadwood pool. So that includes our standing dead trees like snags, down trees, large branches on the ground. Some amount of emissions happen here too as those are decomposed and decay. And then we get carbon that then goes into the soil pool here. And again, there's some amount of emissions that occurs from the soil pool with all the life forms and the organisms that exist in that pool. And we consider all organic materials, not including roots here. Those would be included in the below ground live biomass pool. When we have a managed forests, we also have carbon that can go from the live tree pool into harvested wood products. So those can be both products that we're using, so materials to build homes, other buildings, furniture, paper products, etc. And they can also be carbon that is in harvested wood products that are in landfill. So after those products have been used, when they go to landfill, if they do, they slowly decompose there because it's an anaerobic environment. And so that carbon stays locked away for a fairly long period of time, even as it's in that landfill area. When we look at storage and sequestration rates of these different pools, you can see that there's a wide range. So soils contribute most of the storage in our forests. So over 50% of the carbon is stored in our soils. Our above ground biomass and below ground biomass should come as no surprise that that is the second. That's a very large pool in our live trees. What you can see when you look through a forest, almost 40%. Deadwood is about 3%, and litter is about 6%. But when we look at the sequestration, so this is the flux from the annual flux from the live tree pool into these other pools, and how much is the net, what is the net of that? You can see that this varies considerably. Certainly live trees are contributing the majority to this, which makes sense, more than 75%. We do have considerable net sequestration, net flux coming from the deadwood pool. That means that there's an accrual of carbon in that pool over time in most forests. Soil is about 4%, so it's very slow to change from year to year, even though it stores the majority of the carbon. And the litter is very slow to change to only about 0.2%. And this just means that it decomposes very rapidly, so it doesn't really accrue carbon too quickly. Carbon storage varies over the development of a stand. When we think about forest stand age, and this shows just a zero, a reforested area at year 0. So think of an old field that's growing up with young trees to 125 years. And that's certainly not the extent of our forest age. Our forest ages in our region, that's extent of the majority of our forests currently, but many of our forests can live for many, centuries. Many of our trees can live for much longer than that. So just because this ends here, these trajectories do extend through time. And in fact, up here at the top, there is data from Bill Keaton at the University of Vermont showing only live tree carbon storage, but for old growth stands, which we have very limited old growth stands in the region, but showing that this does continue to year 500 and likely more. And so what this graphic shows is carbon storage, the total amount in the forest, and then divided by these pools, so live tree, soil, litter, and deadwood. And you can see as this forest grows up, the live tree pool is really where the majority of this carbon storage is accruing, which makes sense as these trees begin as seedlings and saplings, grow up and grow bigger trunks and branches and crowns. Root systems are storing immense amount of carbon. The soil layer really is accruing slowly. It's hard to tell from this line, but there is a slow accrual of soil and of carbon in the soil pool, and this will continue. But really does show you how slow this is to build up. Same with the litter layer and deadwood pools. You get most of the buildup of these pools early on in forest development, but they do slowly continue to accrue at the rates I described in the last slide. And what can happen in most forests, though, this is showing example of forests without significant disturbance that may change the size of these pools, which is shown up here in this graphic. So you can have these disturbances that then adjust the amount of carbon. They might flux carbon from this live tree pool to the dead wood or litter pool. And we will look at this example again for carbon sequestration. So there's carbon flux, right? So negative values are sequestration, positive values would indicate emissions. We see that over stand development, we have sequestration in all of these pools, but at different amounts. Again, live tree pool in green is really dominating this sequestration. As we can see in this example, this is for a modeled example for Maple Beech birch forest. And for this example, the maximum, the peak sequestration is really early on in stand development. And compare that to the storage I just showed, where storage accrues over the age and the development of the forest up to old growth forest and continuing. Versus the sequestration rate, the rate at which the forest is taking in carbon dioxide does change through the development and slows down. You see at the other pools, sort of a similar process is that early in the development, the most change in these pools, the sequestration is happening early on in stand development and then slows down, but they're still sequestering carbon that is getting transferred from the live tree pool. When we look at this for old growth forests, again, same data source from Bill Keaton, we see that that this does slow down with older forests, but you see we're still in negative numbers, so this is still sequestration. On average, we're still seeing that old forests sequester carbon. They're just doing it at a much lower rate than younger forests. All right, now I'm going to dive into the carbon pools in more detail and talk about what influences them and what we know about their dynamics. So here again, we have the first pool, which is live trees combined of above ground and below ground biomass. Again, I mentioned that most of about 35 to 40% of our carbon storage on average, and contributes 75% of our carbon sequestration, which is the majority of the amount. Lots of folks are interested in how you would measure and estimate carbon in a tree. And there are two really established methods. Older one is the Jenkins method, using species and diameter of the tree. And we have these equations called allometric or biomass equations that are used to then convert those measurements into the weight of the tree. And these were collected over a series of researchers and painstaking labor to measure all parts of a tree of different species and create these equations. And then we convert to carbon content and then to carbon dioxide equivalent. More recently, we have this component ratio method that's been established and used by the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program by the US Forest Service. And this adds a few more measurements, so including height, decay, and deduction, so defects in the tree that would affect the amount of carbon that it stores. And from these, you then estimate the sound volume of the stem of the bole of the tree, and then use the specific gravity to convert that volume to weight. So those are species-specific equations to convert volume of a tree to its biomass. And then what we then do is use the ratios of the other components from this previous method, Jenkins, and we add those measurements for roots, leaves, and bark branches. Similarly, convert to carbon content and carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's not very straightforward or easy to calculate the carbon in a tree. You need to have field measurements and use of these models and equations that then incorporate some assumptions and modeling error into those results. For carbon flux, it's even harder because you need two time steps. So usually we call this a stock change. So it's carbon storage and or content in year 2 minus carbon content in year 1 would be the flux or the change in carbon storage. And so it's mostly what folks present as carbon storage, and sequestration is just extracted from those measurements. We do have new ways to measure carbon sequestration in a forest. This is a photo at the top right of a flux tower at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. And that actually measures the change in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, which is different than what we are measuring here. We're measuring the change in storage and biomass in a tree. How does carbon vary by species? Well, generally, hardwoods have more carbon by volume because they tend to have denser wood, which is the higher specific gravity. Shown here on the left, so the specific gravity is the relative density of wood compared to water. And you can see the blue species here are generally hardwoods, and green are softwoods, conifers. So, we generally say that hardwoods have higher specific gravity and therefore more carbon content by volume, though not always true. Tamarack has quite a lot of carbon relative to other hardwoods, but it's sort of a rule of thumb. And interestingly, when we look at carbon by weight, conifers actually have more carbon in their wood because their wood generally has more lignin. And lignin, one of the molecules that makes up wood, just has a lot of carbon in it. And so those conifers generally have more carbon by weight. You can see that that's reflected here. Wood with a higher percentage of carbon actually tends to be less dense. And I did mention that that wood is about 50% carbon by dry weight. That's also sort of a rule of thumb and is used by most folks, but know that carbon content can actually range from 30% upwards of 60%. So there is quite a big range there. And carbon content actually can range within a tree and within the season. So different species obviously have different amounts of carbon, but even when we look at early wood, which is wood that is the tree puts on early in the growing season, like right now, versus late wood, which happens later in August. Those different time periods within a season will have different amounts of carbon. So it's much more complex. We use these rules of thumb to help us calculate carbon in a tree and in a forest, but it does lead to some assumptions. The other thing that's important for us to be good communicators on is the difference between carbon in a tree and carbon in a forest. So a tree will see, a healthy tree that has no limits to the amount of space it has or resources will accrue carbon as it grows, right? So this is tree diameter down here and carbon storage. And you can see this exponential increase in carbon stored in that tree. This is really because trees are these three-dimensional creatures. Every year when they add new wood, they're not adding it just around in a circle, they're adding it over every branch, over every part of their whole being. And so that's quite a lot of wood as they grow exponentially bigger. So you can see this is schematic of a sugar maple. If we go from a 10-inch diameter to 20-inch diameter, right, you have a more than double the amount of carbon that's stored or into a 40-inch diameter tree. But when we look at carbon in a forest, so this is per acre, which is different than no per acre over here, this is just per tree, we actually see that even when we look at live tree pools, we have sort of a leveling off of the carbon over time, over the stand age. And this is because as we have fewer trees, they can occupy the space as those trees get older. And when trees are younger, they're really rapidly growing. They're taking in a lot of carbon. They're sort of trying to compete. There are other trees growing tall. And when trees reach maturity, they don't usually grow much taller, and carbon storage will sort of level off. This is really important for us to communicate and be aware of. I hear these two types of carbon confused a lot, versus tree versus a forest. So what impacts a live tree pool? Well, there's a lot that impacts the live tree pool. When we look at this from it's a stand productivity component on here, right? So it's how productive, how vigorous the stand is. That depends on all sorts of factors in our forest, the density of the trees, as I mentioned, the age, the size, the species is really important. Over here, we have graphs showing carbon storage and carbon flux by different forest types. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variability, between a oak hickory forest here in gray versus a spruce balsam fir forest here in light blue. The oak hickory is storing carbon at a higher rate and has an ultimate higher amount of carbon storage. When we look at flux, sequestration is in these negative numbers. We see that this also varies considerably by forest type. Some forests really peak early in their sequestration, some have much more consistent sequestration rates. And that just really is a factor of their dynamics and decomposition rates and structure of those different forests. Mortality versus recruitment, so how quickly are trees dying versus new trees occupying that space, will affect this live tree pool. And anything that changes sequestration and emissions rates. So climate change, drought stress, defoliate insects, disease can all affect this live tree pool pretty considerably. It's very dynamic. One thing we do know is large trees disproportionately contribute to carbon in the forest stand. And this again has to do with their three-dimensional composition and how, just that they're every year adding more and more carbon to an ever increasing structure. And we do know that, as I mentioned here, anything that changes carbon sequestration versus emissions, like insect infestations, will affect the carbon in that forest and in those live trees. The deadwood pool is about 3% of the carbon storage in our forests and contributes about 13% to the annual change in carbon storage or the carbon sequestration that we have. And we look at this by forest type, again, same sort of colors here, carbon storage on the left, carbon flux on the right. We can see that there are differences amongst forest types, which makes sense. They have different rates of branch breakage, different disturbances that affect them, different forest structure. And we also see that this varies by sequestration as well. And you can see here with deadwood, we sort of have these little pulses of carbon going into the deadwood pool. And that happens when we have wind events or ice events that can cause new wood from the live tree pool to enter the deadwood pool. To estimate the amount of carbon in deadwood is more challenging than the tree pool, because not only do we need the size of those pieces of wood, we need to factor in decay class. And you can see here as wood decays over time, that is affecting the amount of carbon in that piece of wood. And so we use these wood density decay curves. This is just showing a few species that we have in our region, but it's not that consistent through time or through these decay classes for each species. So we need to apply species-specific decay functions to convert that biomass in these logs to carbon. The deadwood pool is impacted by inputs. So tree mortality or disturbances that cause branch breakage, and then rates of decomposition. This is really affected by climate, especially temperature and moisture. We do know that decay rate increases with temperature, so it's mean annual temperature on the bottom axis and decay rate. And so that really affects warmer temperatures will have faster rates of decay. The community of decomposers that exist, fungi, earthworms, animals that burrow into deadwood, bacteria, all sorts of organisms use and live and eat wood, and that really affects the rate that wood is decomposed and the ultimate end place of that carbon. The site conditions, the amount of moisture, whether that log is on the ground and touching soil or elevated in the air can make a big difference. and certainly the volume, density, and carbon content in the wood. And we know that actually carbon content is kind of variable. It's really hard to model through the decay process, and it varies by hardwoods, angiosperms, and gymnosperms, conifers. And so that's really important to incorporate when we have either down dead or standing dead, that carbon content is not consistent through time. In general, conifers tend to decompose at a slower rate than hardwoods. The litter layer is about 6% of the total carbon storage in our forests, and only contributes about 1% to a total carbon sequestration, the change in carbon storage every year. It just means that it sort of breaks down almost at the same rate that it is added to. When we look at this by forest type, again, there are variations amongst forest type, with spruce, balsam, fir having the most stored carbon in the litter layer. And that's because their needles are very acidic and they don't break down very fast. You may have noticed this if you're up in these types of forests, that there's a really deep litter layer. And you compare that to oak hickory, those leaves decompose pretty quickly. The flux also varies, where you see the biggest flux though for across all forest types happens early in stand development and then levels off. But you see sometimes there are pulses and changes through time. When we look at this based at a 75-year-old stand as a proportion of the total forest carbon, we can see that this is pretty variable across these forest types. As I mentioned, spruce, balsam, fir has the highest percentage of carbon, total carbon in the litter layer. The litter pool is influenced by the quality and quantity of inputs, which is really dictated by the species, as I mentioned, as well as the decomposition rate. So this is affected by climate, elevations, and which affects length of growing season, like length of time that the decomposer community can be active. Any disturbances that cause mixing of litter into the soil, the community of decomposers. Earthworms are one thing that can cause mixing that we know of in our forest systems, and are basically churning through this litter layer more quickly than would happen otherwise. We actually know that, you think that adding more litter to the forest would maybe allow for more carbon to be stored in the litter layer, but that's actually not true. It really primes the decomposer community, increases the size of them. So folks have seen when they experimentally add more litter in the forest, that it increases carbon dioxide emissions. So what we know about litter, it's sort of in this nice balance. It accrues very slowly and is used by many parts of the forest ecosystem. Soil is a huge percentage of our total carbon storage, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, but it contributes only about 4% to the total annual sequestration. So again, huge amount of carbon stored, very slow to accrue. What we know about carbon in the soil that's changed a lot over, let's say, in the last decade, is that most of the carbon that gets stored into the soil for long periods of time is actually coming from roots, from root exudation. And so this is where we get plants and trees will actually push out carbon from their roots, carbon molecules, to feed other organisms in the soil that they have reciprocal benefits with, like fungi, other bacteria. And so that carbon actually can get locked into the soil, can bound to soil particles, and be stored for a very long amount of time. This figure up here showing different colors across the world, it shows the mean residence, or the maximum residence time of carbon in soils, and these are years. So even in our region, we could have carbon stored in our soil for many thousands of years. That doesn't mean all carbon is stored in the soil for that long. Some is only maybe they're very transient, right? Minutes or hours or days, but we can have carbon that's stored and locked away for a long period of time. Carbon does also enter the soil system through litter breaking down or dead wood breaking down the surface as well. Soil carbon is really more related to the climate than it is to the above ground biomass. This shows latitude. We're about here in our region. Amazon rainforest and rainforests have quite a lot of above ground carbon, but our area and more north than us store considerable amounts of carbon in the soil. That really is a process of slow breakdown and long accrual of that carbon. When we look at this by forest type, these are really general patterns. We are learning a lot about carbon in the soil as time goes on, but we can see there are differences by forest type and differences based on the timing of the peak flux. And again, this really happens early in the development of a forest, but we're, take this with a grain of salt because we are learning a lot about forest soil carbon as time goes on. The soil pool is impacted by respiration rates. So again, this is influenced by climate, elevation, the type of soil, moisture, pH, the fauna or the community in that soil. Depth of measurement is really critical. You may see some soil carbon measurements that measure 10 centimeters or 20 centimeters, others that measure down a meter. So that's really going to affect the amount of carbon that we estimate to be in that soil. And then anything that causes disturbance or mixing or loss. So equipment, tilling, roads, compaction, earthworms will all affect soil carbon. And we know that, again, greater amounts of inputs actually increases soil respiration, similar to litter. So adding more carbon to the system actually really just primes that microbial community, the soil fauna, and creates a bigger community and more respiration. Does vary by forest type and the saturation of the soil. And like I said, we're learning a lot about soil carbon, and we have high amounts of uncertainty in these estimates. I want to sort of end with the last carbon pools that are really important when we talk about managed forests, and that's harvested wood products in use and in landfill. And we get carbon storage in these products for as long as they are in use. So hardwood floors, structural elements that we use in buildings. And then again, as those products are in landfills, slowly decomposing, if that's the route that they find themselves on. We can also get additional mitigation benefits from these products because they can be a substitute for high emissions products like steel, plastics, and concrete. That's sort of a little bit more of a complex topic, but it's important to recognize. And then also when we talk about carbon impacts of harvested wood products, we have a complicated factor that we must consider: leakage. So if we are talking about reducing harvest to keep carbon in the forest, those harvested wood products are a demand that we need to fill. And so those products will likely be harvested elsewhere, and that carbon will still be removed from the forest. So it is a complex thing when we talk about this forest sector carbon cycle, that we have not only the complexities and dynamics in the forest, but we also have human choices and supply and demand. When we look at the carbon in use in harvested wood products and landfill, you can see that there are differences by the type of product that is produced, with things like OSB, oriented strand board, that goes into buildings, storing carbon for much longer than paper, which would make sense. And then in landfill, paper will have more carbon in a landfill early on versus a product like OSB, which is usually used for considerable amounts of time. For example, in Vermont, our harvested wood products contribute about 7% to our total carbon storage for our sector. All right, I'm going to end with some summary take-home points here, because I know there's a lot of information. For forests to help mitigate climate change, it's really important to consider the phrase I like: what does the atmosphere see? And that's reflected in some of the early slides I showed you all with the global carbon pools. And that schematic video, because we need to consider, is this being reflected in the atmosphere? Are our decisions taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or are they keeping it stored and not emitted to the atmosphere? Carbon is very dynamic in a forest. It moves in and out of the carbon pools and the atmosphere. almost near constantly. Of these pools, live tree carbon is the most dynamic, about 75% of a forest total sequestration. But it's really important for us all to recognize that it's incredibly difficult to quantify carbon. We're making lots of assumptions and estimates when we do so. And especially when we're talking about fluxes. So sequestration is a change over time in carbon storage, and particularly when we look at the non-tree pools. So the soil pool, the litter and deadwood pools are even harder to estimate than the live tree pool. Next week, I'll talk about management decisions that we can use to increase carbon or keep carbon in the forest, increase carbon in harvested wood products. We have the most influence on the live tree, deadwood, and harvested wood products pools. The litter and soil pools are most influenced by reducing potential losses, reducing emissions. And how we talk about carbon is really, really important in the individual tree versus the forest area. Are we talking about carbon or carbon dioxide equivalent? Are we talking about sequestration or storage? And so this is really critical when we are communicating with landowners or each other to make sure that we're talking about apples to apples in terms of carbon. That's what I have. I will remind you that the next module, if you're interested, is on forest carbon management and the science of those management decisions that I'll be presenting next week on May 11th. And again, Ali Kasiba, my email address is alexandra.kasiba@vermont.gov if you would like to be in touch. All right, thank you. I'll open it to questions.
Thank you, Ali. Fantastic presentation. I'd suggest maybe keeping the PowerPoint up because maybe you will need to go back, but it's up to you. So a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and a lot of back and forth in the chat. And so I'm going to do my best. This is Charlie Levesque. I'm going to do my best to hit the high points, and we're going to end promptly at 10:30, whether we've completed answering all the questions or not. And they'll be somewhat chronological from the start of the presentation, Ali, as you can imagine. So I'll start off. You all remember the graphs early on. A lot of them are showing carbon sequestration as negative numbers or as reductions, and that's a little confusing for folks. So maybe you can just talk about that a little more. Why it's looked at that way as a negative number.
Yeah, it is a little confusing, but it's really because we can have both sequestration and emissions, and we often need to present them on the same graph. And so we can think about sequestration as taking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so it's reducing that amount, whereas emissions are increasing that amount. But that's really, you might see that sequestration is represented by a positive number by some researchers or communicators. But I like to do it because we often are talking both about emissions and sequestration at the same time, and to make sure that that's clear across when we're communicating.
So moving on, there were several questions around your graphs that showed carbon storage in the states in the Northeast, why they weren't all similar. Some of them sort of got answered, but maybe you want to talk about, try to answer the basic question: why aren't the numbers showing carbon storage per acre the same for all the states in the region?
Yep, for carbon storage.
Yeah.
Yep. So first, yes, for total carbon storage amount of forest, the total carbon stock per acre is actually, considerably similar across our states. The one state that we see the lowest amount is Maine, and this is because they have more timber harvests than the other states. But that doesn't mean, this doesn't reflect that with higher timber harvest, Maine is storing a lot of carbon in harvested wood products. So this does not include carbon storage in harvested wood products, only what is stored in the forest. And so that's what that's reflecting. There's also differences in forest type here and in climate, right? So, northern Maine is not going to store as much carbon in its forest because of colder climate, shorter trees than, forests in Massachusetts.
Thanks. A lot of questions and discussion in the chat. You kind of closed in answering this, but let's talk a little bit about the role of solid wood products especially in accounting for carbon storage. Some folks were concerned that in some of the numbers that are being showed that we're not fully accounting for storage if it's cut and put into long-term storage, through solid wood products. So maybe talk around that bigger issue.
Can you, I'm sort of unclear what the question is exactly.
Yeah, it really is all of the numbers that you showed, the graphs that you showed in terms of storage. Are we fully accounting for trees that have been cut and a portion of which has gone into solid wood products, which continues to store carbon? So we certainly know how to talk about carbon storage in our standing forests, but when we remove the trees and they're kept in long-term storage, are we accounting for that?
I'll talk about it. I'm still unclear what the question is, but
well, for instance, just the graphs that you showed before that showed how much standing carbon in the forests of the region. Have we really fully accounted for past sequestration that has occurred, or storage rather, that has occurred in solid wood products over time? Because this is showing kind of a static shot, but it's not really accounting for other carbon that has been sequestered, which is now removed and in solid wood products.
Yes. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes. So accounting for the full carbon sector, forest carbon sector, is really, really challenging. I've done this in Vermont, and that is correct, that we would need to actually look back in time and consider all the carbon that we have already, from wood products that we have produced, is already being stored in our, most of us probably live in wood houses or have some sort of wood furniture around us. That's all carbon that came out of a forest some time ago. And we don't have a great way to account for that. It is really challenging for us to document accurately harvests from our forests. So there are some efforts that are looking into this. But yeah, that's one area that we could really improve on. Probably in forest carbon, that's the one we have the least that we could improve on the most. And I sort of touched on through this presentation that even within our forests, we have a lot of uncertainty in measuring and estimating live tree carbon, dead tree carbon, soil carbon, leaf litter carbon, and certainly harvested wood product carbon. Yes, so that is hard to account. And looking at these figures at the end of the presentation too, I want to stress that these are, a lot of what we have for data for these rates of carbon in wood products and in landfill are modeled estimates. These are probably not going to be, these aren't going to be accurate for every situation, every state, every condition. It sort of gives us a ballpark for those different amounts. But yeah, we certainly need more research and understanding into this to fully quantify carbon and harvested wood products. And I mentioned too, I think on this slide, that they can be a substitute for these high emissions products. So if we use, wood products in place of steel I-beams, right? That is becoming more common, mass timber products. We actually get additional savings from using those products instead of steel. Steel will release more greenhouse gases, very intensive to produce, manufacture, to mine, then transport. And we have a hard time, it's challenging to estimate those savings. So we sort of have a combined issue here, that estimating both the harvested wood products, where they go, the manufacturing process, and then what they're used instead of is really complex. And then we add the leakage factor too. We need to consider if we do change our management. So it's a really complex topic that folks are looking into.
Thanks for the answer. Sorry, my question took a while to get clear for you, but I think you really nailed it with your answer. So a couple of reminders, we do have a few more questions, but because it's been asked over and over again, the recordings of the webinar will be made available and the slides will also be made available. And again, if your question isn't being answered, and or if you have other questions, you simply need to email me, Charlie Levesque, levesque@inrsllc.com, and we'll get an answer back to you. But more questions. So you certainly answered this, but it's worth talking about some of the nuance, and that is the difference between sequestration rates in younger stands and mature stands or old growth stands, and particularly what happens to older stands or old growth stands. Do they eventually get to a place, your graph shows they continue to net sequester over time, but can they get to an eventual place where there is actually an increase of emissions resulting from not a net sequestration rate because the stand's so old and falling apart? Go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, I would say we don't know the answer to that. So we've cleared majority of our forests here in New England and New York. We've very, very few remnant old growth stands left. And where they do exist, they are often anomalous. They were there because they couldn't be harvested for some reason sometimes. And so data from Bill Keaton up here in the top graph are from these remnant old growth stands. But we can't follow the carbon sequestration of those stands for hundreds of years. We don't have data like that. So the way we look at this is we'll take a 100-year-old stand, a 150-year-old stand, a 200-year-old stand, and measure the carbon sequestration and then extrapolate. And we don't have, there's not a lot of examples of stands that are 400, 500 years old. So we really don't know what that, what that maximum age is relative to sequestration. And again, that the concept of the stand versus the landscape is really important too. You may have any individual stand that could be a source of carbon because of disturbances, and then other ones that are a sink of carbon. And so it really depends on the individual forest. And that's really hard when we have very few old growth forests left to sort of get a landscape scale understanding. Based on research done in other parts of the world where they do have forests that exist that are older than the ones we have here. Yes, most of them are still sequestering carbon, or net sequesters, net sinks, but there are ones that are also sources, and it really depends on the disturbances that forest experiences. But in general, as trees die, other trees take their place, and so you have this really complex dynamic that happens in forests of any age.
Thanks. Questions about deadwood, and a little confusing because some of the graphs you showed, show that that over time there can be an increase in sequestration in the deadwood pool. And so obviously that's dynamic. And so maybe talk a little bit more about what happens with deadwood in terms of sequestration over time, and what happens when that wood breaks down.
Yes, so the way that carbon is getting fluxed from the live tree pool to the deadwood pool really has to do with branch breakage, which happens really regularly in our forests. Any windstorm, even sort of mild ones, fine branches, branches will break. But then with tree mortality, and so you do get this dynamic. Again, these data here are really modeled estimates. They are not going to be reflective of every forest area. They're really used to be general examples of these dynamics. So what we see across forest types is we usually have the biggest influx of carbon to the deadwood pool early on in stand development. And that happens during this, stem exclusion stage that forests go through, where they're rapidly growing. There's thousands of trees, per acre, and not all of them can survive, right? There's not enough room, there's not enough resources. And so some of them die, they become part of the deadwood pool. And then over time, you get these pulses of carbon that gets fluxed from the live tree pool to the deadwood pool from these disturbances. So from windstorm events, ice storm events. And so that gets reflected for these little blips that happen here. The timing of these is going to vary depending on that disturbance pattern and the other site characteristics. But this is sort of a general example of how that happens. As far as where what happens to the deadwood, it really goes through these decay stages. So there's all sorts of fungi, microorganisms, bacteria, insects that are burrowing, decomposing, breaking apart, using the wood as their own energy source, and you get this decomposition of wood over time. And so a lot of this goes into organisms, right? So they grow bigger and reproduce, and then they're going to have excrement that will have then carbon that goes into the sort of organic layer in the soil, or they die. These organisms die and they become part of that really dense organic layer we see right under the leaf litter layer in our forests. And eventually some of that carbon will make its way into the soil, but that process is pretty slow to sort of percolate down into the soil system and be stored there for any amount of time.
A few more. We're not going to get to all of them as we thought, but there are a few more. You're going to talk about this next time, but it might be helpful to talk about soil disturbance from harvesting at a broad scale here, because there are a number of questions around it. It's obviously of interest to folks. So what happens with soil carbon when we start driving big machines around in it?
Yeah, no, that's great. I will get into that next week. There's a few things that happen. One is compaction. So the air spaces in our soil, most soil is something like, a quarter or more air pockets. And so those get compacted. And so when you remove air from a system, you get different processes that occur. And oftentimes it becomes anaerobic conditions. So you can actually get methane production. I didn't really touch too much on methane, but methane is a greenhouse gas. It's actually it's a very powerful greenhouse gas as well, like carbon dioxide. And so you can actually get methane release. When we also churn up and till soils, we mix the coarser materials like leaves, twigs, things like that into the soil. And again, you can get this anaerobic decomposition rather than aerobic decomposition, and it can release methane. And so it just changes any sort of disturbance we have to the soil, sort of changes that balance of the rate at which the organisms and things are processing that carbon, and also how that decomposition happens. Does it produce carbon dioxide? Does it produce methane in the process? And really the big thing is that it takes a long time for carbon to become assimilated and stored in the soil carbon pool. So if we're doing that process, if we're churning up soil, tilling it, compacting it, and we're changing those processes, that's going to happen at a faster rate than carbon can go back into that soil system. Compare that to the live tree pool. It's very dynamic. It responds very quickly. We could use a patch cut or clear cut in a forest, removing the live tree carbon pool, and within 25 years or something, we'll have, it depends on the forest and the forest conditions, but we can have a rapid regrowth of that pool, taking in carbon from the atmosphere, and we can get back up to those levels that we were before the harvest within a few decades. Depends on the forest versus the soil. It's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of years to recover those losses. It's a very, very, very slow process. And so what we want to do is keep it where it is as much as possible.
Maybe we have a chance for two more, I guess, Allie. And one is sort of a general question about management, which you'll talk about next time, but I guess narrowing it down, do we know that sequestration rates in forests are different if they're managed as even age forests versus uneven age or all age forests? Do we have a sense of that?
Yes, so yes, we do. It depends on all, it's sort of hard to paint a broad brush, but yes, we do know if you have an even age forest, you're gonna have trees of all the same age, right? So they're sort of at the same physiological stage and the same size, right? Versus trees, uneven age management, where you're gonna have more variation in the age and size of the tree. So you just have more complexity in that forest and more more space for different trees to have different rates of sequestration storage. So when we think about, especially on the landscape scale, it's really critical we look at those sequestration versus storage charts that I showed over time. Having a diversity of stand ages and stand conditions is really critical. So we sort of balance that storage, which is the amount of carbon we have in our forest, versus the rate at which that carbon is taken out of the atmosphere, the sequestration. And so that's really critical. But yeah, it sort of depends, and I can get in that. It might be saved for next week to get into some of the nitty gritty of different management techniques to alter those age and size class distributions in our forests.
Great, thank you so much, Ali. And maybe it's time to stop sharing your screen, and I'll have some closing remarks here. Thanks again. And thank you everyone for participating and all the great questions that you posed. So reminder, if your question didn't get answered, send me an email with a question. We'll get it answered for you. Of course, the recordings will be all made available. They'll all be on the website, right? The website is where everything for this whole effort is stored. And so anything you want is going to be there, both the recordings and then also the PowerPoint presentations. For those of you who are foresters and stayed on the whole webinar, you'll get a SAF CFE certificate for this time sent directly to you via email, and the email address that you registered for the webinar on. If you do not get that, you can email me and we'll get you on. Zoom actually sends us a report to show who was actually on the webinar. So hopefully you are on the webinar and for the whole time, because otherwise you may not show up on that list. So again, next webinar is next Wednesday at 9 a.m. to 10:30. And that, of course, will be the science of forest carbon management. And we'll get into some of the questions that got asked towards the end of the program. Remember, the website has everything. It also has the state leads. You're welcome to contact me anytime, but you can also contact your state leads to answer any questions that you might have. And I want to thank you all. And of course, Ali, for the wonderful presentation. And we'll see you next week.